was a 16-year-old kid when I was in the riots in 1975, and I was a 28-year-old being unemployed for 8 years person. They're not really interlinked as it would seem, but they are interlinked into me. I suppose it was a big risk. They were taking a risk, I felt, on a group of black, long-term unemployed individuals to build their own homes. My view on housing will have been that there hasn't been enough investment in social housing from way back in the 60s. The housing ministry haven't really looked at housing. For example, they've been demolishing lots of houses in lots of areas and breaking them down, but they've not been building enough houses to replace them. So, for example, I'm just doing some consultancy for Leeds City Council now, where Leeds has to build 70,000 houses over the next 12 years because they're way behind on the housing numbers they should have been building over the last 20 years. So that's been a misinvestment of government in housing stock. Even in 81, when the riots were in 81, housing was a big issue. The riot that they talk about more, because the riots of 75, which I was locked up for, were very much a Leeds thing, whereas the riots of 1981 were very much, and which the government talks about a lot, were very much an economic riot, where the black communities were saying that we felt we weren't getting into certain kinds of white-collar, blue-collar jobs, in the sense that our parents all worked in the foundries, our parents worked for British Rail, our parents worked for some of the bigger organisations, but we, the kids that were born here, we were actually wanting to become bankers, we wanted to be solicitors, we wanted to be accountants. We didn't want to go and work in the industrial thing. So the riots of 1981 were more economic, about getting over the argument that housing was number one, employment number two, education number three, and it went down the list, elderly health and well-being, but housing was the number one drum bearer for the disadvantaged African Caribbean community, because generally to get on the council housing list you had to go into private accommodation before you could actually get onto the housing list. So for example, my mother in 1966, she had to go and live in a street which was almost derelict with toilets outside. I didn't move into a house with a toilet inside, hot water, until 1971. I was an 11-year-old child by that time, because you had to go round and up and through the things to get into a good house. A lot of the black communities right across England were rioting, and it started with Bristol, and it just bam, 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 Bristol, Leeds, Birmingham, London, Manchester, all the black communities in the country were rioting. We never planned it, but it happened. And I think the beauty of the 1981 riots, it was very much about economics, better housing, better education for the kids, better employment opportunities. And it was quite strange because that was 2 years after Margaret Thatcher came into power. Margaret Thatcher came into power in 1979. In 1966, there had been an equality law passed in 1966 that hadn't been implemented by government. So she brought a document out called Section 11. This Section 11 money came about after the riots of 81, which was Section 11 funding, which gave local authorities the right to be proactive in employing BME people. So a lot of African Caribbean people got jobs in housing, got jobs in social services, got jobs in youth work, got jobs they weren't privy to prior to that. So for me and the self-build thing, housing was a very big issue for us. And I would think on reflection in life that no matter whether you're an animal, a bird, or a human being, having a roof over your head is actually a basic requirement. It's not systematic, it's just a humanic thing that you're supposed to have a roof over your head. Where do you sleep at night? Where do you live? So housing has always been a major talking point. So in 83, they created Section 11. Then I think another quango that was created was the Housing Corporation, which helped initiate housing associations because what happened is local authorities, the power to build social housing was taken away from housing associations by the Conservative government, because most of the big cities like Leeds were actually Labour-run cities. So that Labour was collecting all the rents from the housing they had, but they didn't want to give it to the Conservatives. They created this quango called the Housing Corporation, which empowered housing associations to come into communities and deliver social housing. And what happened to how I got to Frontline was a housing association called Harewood House came into Chapeltown and held a couple of public meetings. And within their public meetings, they came and said, well, we're a housing association. We've been given a grant by the government to come in and develop social housing in your area. But that's going to mean demolishing streets of houses, old houses, which were derelict, which had been left to become derelict by the local authority, which seems to be a plan to run down areas, leave the properties, let them become derelict. And then you have everybody moves out, then you have the power to go in and knock them all down and rebuild. So the housing association came and they said, when we come, if we get to build in your community, we're going to offer you better homes, but we're also going to offer you jobs, potential of getting employment within helping build these houses. Well, the housing associations came because they got us to agree with them that they could come. But what I noticed, all the sites that they were building, that no black people were on the sites. And I was a young guy that I did motor mechanics from I was young, so I wasn't actually interested in construction. But my stepfather and a lot of the older generation of men that lived in our area, they were tradesmen. At that time, they have this history about absent fathers create bad kids, but what used to happen is our male parents who had skills in construction would have to, for example, travel to Scotland to get work, travel to Newcastle. They couldn't get no work in the city of Leeds because it was seen that the skills our parents came from the Caribbean with weren't up to the standard of the tradesmen in the UK. So what happened, a lot of our fathers would go away and work in Scotland. They'd be away for 6 weeks and then come back. When we was discussing with the housing association in the public meetings about building these social houses, we said we've got lots of our fathers and uncles that have trades. Can you guarantee they'd get some jobs? The housing association was, oh yeah, no problem, we'll be giving jobs to local people. It never materialised. So when they were actually building what was Reginald Terrace, which was right in the heart of Chapeltown, one day I was just walking and I noticed there were no tradesmen on that site that were from the Black and African Caribbean community. I suppose, and that is what stirred me in a fashion to look at this self-build idea, because remarkably I'd just seen something on the TV about a project in Bristol called Zanzili. A group of men in Bristol were building a block of flats, and I just happened to see on BBC 2 one night. And then what happened is a young man called Clinton Cameron, he was the chair of Leeds Federated Housing. I'd been unemployed for about 8 years. Well, I put a challenge to him that if he didn't find something constructive for me to do, I would probably end up be doing something destructive within the community, which was very true, because at that time drugs were quite high on the agenda, and there was an open opportunities for me to get involved in the drug trade. He came up with this idea of self-build. So he says, right, self-build, what do you think? Can you get a group of guys together that might be interested in building their own home? I was like, oh. And then it clicked back to the thing that I saw on the television. So what I says to him is, okay, people who are disadvantaged don't believe in the hype. They don't believe in the rhetoric. They believe in what they can see, touch and feel. So for example, if you say to anybody, even if they're disadvantaged, can you go over there and pick that cup up for me? They know what a cup looks like. They don't know what colour it's going to be, but they can go and find it, yeah? So what happened then was they managed to secure the money for me to take a group of guys, all of them unemployed like myself, no skills, some of them had been in prison and come out of prison, to visit the Zanzili project in Bristol. So we took them down to Bristol, they had a look, they met with the self-builders that built that, and we came back and we decided that we're going to try this. And so we created Frontline Self-Build, called that because the guys felt that they were from the front line, because they used to all be on the hayfield, which was classed as the front line, and they wanted it to be representative of them. So it took us about 6 years going over the hoops, under the hurdles, over the fences. It took us about 6 years to actually physically get on the site. Back in 1991 was the last time there was an economic downturn and the housing market went crazy and interest rates went up to 18%. So we would try to do a project to build our own houses against the backdrop of 40,000 houses, I think, a week being repossessed. The building society that we were working with, which was the Provincial Building Society, had also just gone bust because of self-build. But we decided we were going to stick with this task. Guys got trained, blah, blah, blah. We managed to secure money from Red Nose to employ a site foreman. So it was quite interesting. We formed a partnership with Leeds Federated Housing. Originally, we were going to go for outright ownership. Because of the housing market crashing, we then had to negotiate a shared ownership with Leeds Federated Housing, which actually was a good way, because what it did, Leeds Federated Housing would act as the big brother. They would draw down the housing funding. They would help us line up. We would build, give the invoice to them. They would give us some more money. So it worked really well. I have to thank Eric Bowen, who was the Director of Housing, Leeds City Council, for taking the risk on us. I have to thank a guy called Peter Redman, who was the Chief Executive of Leeds Federated Housing, who went on to go down to Notting Hill Housing Trust after our project. It took us 18 months to physically build 92,000 bricks, 52,000 blocks. The 12 houses were completed October 1996. It was a funny time at that time because the government had designated 8 task forces across Britain, and Chapeltown happened to be one of the communities that got a task force. And because we had task force money, we actually secured a site to become a construction training centre within our area. We did do 6 weeks of initial training, but that was more about housing association law, project law, blah, blah, blah. And the 12 original guys that I tried to get into the project, half of them dropped out. Because over 6 years, different things came up in different people's lives. So some of them dropped out. We had a training centre which they created for us, and we had that for like a year and a half before we got on site. There was a choice of, in principle, 6 sites. The site we went after was actually quite a fantastic site. It was up near Roundy Park, quite a prestigious area. They said, no, we couldn't have that. So they whittled it down. We ended up getting the worst of the 6 sites. We ended up getting a site that all the houses had been demolished on it because it was a stone quarry site, and the houses had subsidence. So what we had to do with that site, we had to do something like £130,000 worth of groundworks underneath it. On training centres, you build and knock down, you build and knock down. So what we did, we got the training centre, which allowed us to build sections of the house on little small sections that we could get a feel of how it went. So they learned how to lay the first ground level of bricks because they're a bit thermal because they're going into the dirt. Then you learn how to put window frames in. Then you learn how to put doors in. So we did little pilot sections of the house on the training centre. That's how we did it. The site was the worst site they gave us, and we made the best site of it. With our project, unlike a lot of other self-build projects that happen around the country, I'm sorry to say, we did something like 90% of the work ourselves. We did all the drainage, we laid 92,000 bricks, we laid 52,000 blocks, we put all the roof tiles on. As a group, we did all of that, all the scaffolding. The only things we subcontracted out on reality and on reflection was the putting in of banisters and the fitting of kitchen unit tops, the actual top of the unit, because if you buy a long sheet of it and if you make a wrong cut, the whole sheet's wasted. And we subcontracted the electrics and we subcontracted the fitting of gas because we couldn't do them. And if I look back, we had the opportunity to do timber frame, Walter Sequel method, But I thought if we'd have done that, they'd have thought we were Mickey Mouse builders back 20 odd years ago. So I really set our levels high. One of the things I thought was important was exit strategy, because you're taking these disadvantaged, unempowered people up a hill. You know, you're empowering them to get the skills to build their own houses. But in my opinion, what are we going to do with them after? So my exit strategy, what I thought was the level of accreditation they get is paramount. So we set a minimum requirement of NVQ level 2. So I managed to secure some funding, which was quite funny. So I secured this funding from the Training and Enterprise Council. So what I would do, I said, right, if you complete your NVQ level 1, I'll give you £100. We'll get £100 increment then. And if you complete NVQ level 2 and all the units towards it, you'll get £250. And if you go on to NVQ level 3, you'll get £500, which was an incentive. But there was a method to my madness. I was trying to ensure that the guys that went on the project came off of the project better equipped for employment within the industry. And it worked. All members of our self-build group got NVQ level 2. Some of them got units toward NVQ level 3, and some of them got NVQ level 3, which was very good in the sense that they were employable to go out and find work. But the second part about that, our exit strategy was going to be to create Frontline Trust. And Frontline Trust was going to be a platform for local contractors to join with the ex-frontline builders to actually start tendering for work from the local authority. So for example, this area that we lived in, Leeds 7, has an annual housing maintenance contract of £5 million per annum. So the idea was that they could then go on to take on some work from the local authority, become a contractor to the local authority, where they could do works within communities, maintenance work on houses. Them jobs that sometimes the council have on their waiting list, but they're not massive priorities. Some people end up waiting sometimes 2 years because they've got rising damp in this corner of the house. And the real problem with the rising damp is that the gutters need cleaning. So small jobs like that. So that was the idea. We would create Frontline Trust, which would then go on to be employing local young people. So employing people like ourselves in the future. So that was the idea, which worked well to a point, because they finished their houses. The housing associations locally were quite impressed. And Unity Housing Association, they gave them the first job, which was the conversion of a 3-story house into flats. So they got that job, they did well, they got a few other jobs, but the work never maintained. One thing about when you give people skills, people start talking to them, and the girlfriend starts saying, oh, why don't you come and do this? And my uncle wants you to do this, and there's a job over here. So it broke down a little bit. The guys fell out with each other a little bit, but the core of them stuck together. Many of them now, 21 years on, are still in construction. One of them went on to become the manager of a housing project, their maintenance department, a project called Latch. Randolph became their maintenance manager. A few of the others went on to create a building construction company. And many of them, out of the 12 that built the houses, I would say 7 of them are still within the construction world. 2 of them have passed away, unfortunately. The others are working, but maybe not in construction.